I'm Sean with Boom Reactive. I switched from Canon cameras to Sony cameras about 6 months ago, and now that it's been 6 months of using Sony cameras, I wanted to take a second and talk about why I switched and what I think now 6 months later. Before I get started, it's important to know, blah, 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 cameras, pick the one that's right for you. The one that's right for me is based off of what I shoot, and a lot of what I shoot is interview style, documentary style, where I'm capturing both seated interviews, which I get to light, usually the way that I want to light it, and B-roll, which for me a lot of times is very rushed, where I'm showing up in a place where something's going on and I need to capture what's happening. It's not the kind of B-roll where I get to take my time to set up shots of products and do things slowly. I want to be doing more of that, and I am slowly doing more and more, but a lot of what I do is very quick, where I need to switch lenses fast, where I need to move quickly from rig to rig. So knowing that that's what I shoot, let me continue. So the initial reasons that I wanted to switch from Canon to Sony, and I was using a 5D Mark III, a 5D Mark II, and an 80D. And I was using these primarily for video. Everything that I'm about to say is primarily for video. And I wanted to switch to Sony because 4K was an option with Sony cameras that Canon still to this day makes pretty cost prohibitive. If you want to get into 4K, you've got to spend some serious money or deal with some severe lack of flexibility with the cameras that do shoot 4K, where it's heavily cropped and not the best codecs. I wanted to do 4K. I wanted to make that available for myself and my clients without breaking the bank. I also wanted to be able to shoot slow motion, and the 80D would shoot 60 frames a second, which is fine, but it didn't let me get like gorgeous, mouth-watering slow motion footage at 120 frames a second, which, while it doesn't seem like that big of a difference, is a huge difference. That's twice as much speed. That's twice as much as you can slow something down and let that moment fill space. That was important to me. I also appreciate the smaller size of mirrorless cameras compared to DSLRs. Like, you're just putting more space between you and the sensor to make space for this mirror. When it's mirrorless, everything can be a little thinner, and I'm sure you've looked. The Sony cameras are much, much smaller and lighter than the big Canon cameras are, because it's a different style of camera. It's a mirrorless camera compared to a DSLR. Cost was also an issue. The Canon cameras, especially as you get into the higher, more cinematic stuff, is really expensive. Again, I wanted to switch to 4K, and I wanted to do it without having to refinance my entire company. Sony lowered that friction point to make 4K and slow motion much more affordable than Canon makes it. The Sony cameras also shoot in log profiles, and I know that Canon has added that now via software update, but when I switched, it wasn't really a good option on my cameras, and it was sort of a fake option. Sony shoots in true log, and yes, you have to bump up your ISO for the S-Log too, but it's a log profile, and bumping up to 1600, I think, isn't that big of a deal a lot of times. Another reason I wanted to make the switch is that the Sony camera's sensor is stabilized. And so with the Canon sensor, it's not stabilized, and I know the newer ones are, but Sony really had some great technology, and they were first here, and that was appealing to me when I made the switch. But no matter what lens you put on, if the lens has image stabilization or not, the sensor has image stabilization that goes a long way to taking out some of the shake from handheld. And while it's still shaky if you're running along, I found that I can hold this camera still enough, like especially at weddings and when I'm shooting B-roll, that it looks like it's on a tripod. It takes enough out of it where if I hold it steady and I've got my feet underneath me and it's not super windy or crazy or I'm not getting bumped into, it can look like a nice static shot. And that to me is super valuable, because that means that a lot of the time I can get away without having extra equipment, extra stabilizers, and just handheld I can shoot in a way that is going to be usable for a client on a professional level. So that meant a lot to me, and in practice has been a huge, huge lifesaver. And lastly, and I don't know why Sony is unique in this regard, but the a7S II, the reason people love this camera for video is because in low light, it is incredible. And I don't know why no one else bothers to do what they did, but they took a full frame sensor, same size sensor as the 5D Mark II, 3, and 4, and 6D, and all the other Canons, but they only put 12 megapixels on it instead of 22, 28, or 30, or whatever the Canons are doing now, and even what the other Sonys are doing. But with 12 megapixels, the pixels are huge and they can absorb a ton of light, and so I'm able to do things in low light that I wasn't able to get close to with the Canon. One of my favorite examples where this was a huge difference after I made the switch was I was shooting inside Powell Symphony Hall here in St. Louis, and it's where the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra plays. And it's a dim theater, it's a dim orchestra hall, and there's nothing we could do to light the entire thing. And the Canon footage was always just sort of grainy because you had to bump the ISO so high to see the details in the wood grain and stuff. With the Sony, not a problem at all. We were able to see everything. And the same is especially true as I've shot a few weddings and stuff like that. The low light capabilities of the Sony a7S II were a huge draw for me to make the switch, and have proven themselves to me 10 times over that it's an incredible camera in low light. Now, I had some concerns as I switched from Canon to Sony, and I wanted to talk about those and have they been addressed? Now, 6 months later, how do I feel about these concerns? Were they good concerns or was it sort of useless? And the first one that I hear everyone complain about is battery life. The Canons get terrific battery life. The Sonys, people hate the battery life on these cameras. And for me, it hasn't really been a problem. I carry extra batteries no matter what. The batteries are pretty small. They're smaller than the Canon batteries are. And so to put one in your pocket is not a big deal. To put 10 of them in your bag is not a big deal. I've yet to be in a situation where like I had a take go so long that it ran out of batteries. Like the battery lasts for an hour or so, worst case scenario. And so to film and to get everything that I'm needing to get, and when it gets down to like 20, 30%, I'll swap it out if I'm at a shoot for a few hours and I can charge the other ones. I've yet to run into a problem because of battery life on this camera. It's fine, just be prepared for it, don't be stupid, you'll be fine. Next up, people complain about the color science of Canon versus Sony and how the skin tones look like aliens on Sony. I've never noticed this. I've never noticed this, it's never been a problem. I've never had a client complain about anything. Between the perfectly good color science in the Sony and its ability to shoot in log, which then you can color correct really easily in post, I've yet to have any issues with the color science and with skin tones looking weird. I've only been impressed with the picture quality coming out of this camera, and my clients share the same thoughts. Another fear was overheating. The Sony a7S II, if filming in 4K internally, has a tendency to overheat, people said. I didn't notice it. I've never had the camera overheat. I've used it out in the sun for hours, filming in 4K, filming in slow motion. I've never not been able to use the camera. I've seen people in YouTube videos like stress test it and put hot lights on it and stuff. I use LED lights and I shoot in a studio, so most of the time it's fine. But again, out in the field, I've never had an issue with the camera overheating and me not being able to use it. And I've never even had to turn on that setting where you can like set that threshold for the overheating even higher. I just keep it on the standard mode and it's never been a problem. With the camera being 12 megapixels, I did have a concern with still photos, and especially doing time lapse where you're doing still photos. Having a 30 megapixel photo makes you, it gives you a lot of flexibility in post to zoom in and to crop in on it and still be in full 1080p or even 4K resolution. With this only shooting in 12 megapixels, I was concerned about it. Again, I've yet to run into a problem, and I also use a Sony a6500, that's what I'm shooting with now, and that's what I use to, if I really need some high resolution, it shoots at like 28 megapixels, it's fantastic. But 1080p footage is like 3 megapixels, and 4K footage is like 8 or 9 megapixels. So even if I'm shooting stills with this and trying to zoom into 4K later, I still have some flexibility. I was shocked. I never went until recently and found out like what megapixels is 4K. It's really not that high. And the fact that a 12 megapixel photo can be printed and blown up and be in fantastic quality means that I've yet to run into an issue because of the lower resolution of the a7S II. And I also, again, have other cameras that I can use if I need something specific that my Wonder camera won't do. Yeah, fast forward, there's my sneak peek of the conclusion. It's a Wonder camera, I love this thing. And my last two concerns about switching, these did come true, and these are concerns, but I'll explain why. The first is the slow startup speed. Canon, you turn it on, you're ready to shoot, especially photos. Like turn it on, you can take a photo a second later. Sony takes a minute to warm up. Not a minute, it takes like 4 or 5 seconds, which most of the time is fine because we're turning on our cameras, we're setting up shots where we know we're going to film, so the camera's on. It's only been an issue when I've been vlogging a little bit and I quickly want to turn on the camera to get something. But most of the time, knowing that this takes a little bit, if I'm prepared to shoot, I leave the camera on. It falls asleep on its own and then it wakes back up pretty quickly. I've never run into a problem because of it, but it's true, it does start up slower than the Canons do. And lastly, and this was a problem for me, the autofocus on the Sony camera is incredible. What's not incredible is autofocus with Canon lenses using an adapter. And I used the Metabones 4 adapter, and it was fine for photos. It was pretty janky for like continuous autofocus in a video. And so, yes, that was a problem. It was a problem for me to use Canon glass exclusively on the Sony camera. So my workaround, I was fortunate enough where I was able to sell off a lot of my Canon glass and buy Sony glass. And so now I have the full range from 16 to 200 in several different ways. I've got 5 lenses now, 6, 7 lenses. I have a lot of lenses now for Sony that all work amazingly, and the autofocus is faster and snappier than it was with the Canons. I like that on the A6500, I can touch to focus. I have to set the points manually here, but again, most cases I can set it up, I can take my time, I can do that. I've never had a problem autofocusing with my Sony lenses, but again, I had to buy Sony glass. And so if you don't have access to Sony glass, or you don't have the budget to make the full switch from Canon to Sony with all of your glass, be prepared to accept some of the frustrations that are gonna come with using lens adapters to go from Canon to your Sony camera, because that was a stumbling point for me. But that was the only stumbling point for me. Other than that, this camera has given me no problems, and I'm a huge fan of it. So it's been 6 months, and those are my concerns, the reasons why I switched and my concerns about switching, and some of the other things that I've discovered along the way that weren't a reason for me switching, but that I really have noticed after making the switch. One, the custom buttons. The custom buttons on the Sony, I really like. My ability to quickly access white balance, and I can custom set them, and I change them depending on the shoot, but some of them I have to be focus assistant zooming so that I can really check if something's in focus for like an interview shot. I can do focus peaking in camera. There's a lot that I've got set up here so that I can really quickly make adjustments, which I wasn't able to do on the Canon. And lastly, the biggest thing that I knew was going to be a change going into it, but I didn't realize how impactful it would be, is that the Sony has an electronic viewfinder, and being mirrorless, it means that what it's showing on the screen or in the viewfinder is what's happening out of the lens. Is where with the Sonys, when you're looking through the viewfinder, the mirror is down. And so when you're doing video, you're limited to what you see on the screen. And when I'm out in the sun, when I'm moving and grooving, if I don't have a big external monitor with a lens hood or something, the fact that with the Sony, you can't really tell. You end up trying to like put your hand over it so you can see, and luckily I wear big stupid hats all the time. But it was a problem to see what the exposure was like, to see what my framing was like and all that in bright sunlight without a whole bunch of extra equipment. And the fact that with the Sony camera, I can put my eye up to the viewfinder and see with no distraction, with no light, with no glare, with no reflection. I can see exactly what my shot looks like. That is huge. That is a game changer, not only for when I'm out in the field, but especially for weddings. Weddings, it has been huge, because you're in low light or you're out in a field while the ceremony is happening. You're running from place to place and trying to get a whole bunch of variety in a very limited amount of time. And the fact that I don't have to have that monitor and lens hood and all this extra stuff, I just put the camera up to my eye and see the video of what's happening with the right aperture, and like the exact video I can see in the viewfinder is huge. And I didn't expect to end up leaning on that as much as I do, but I do. So that's it. I'm so happy that I switched from Canon to Sony. I regret that it took me so long to make the switch, because having made the switch, I've been capable of a lot more. My videos for my clients have gotten a lot better. These are great cameras. They're great for stills. They're just not committed to video like Sony is, in my opinion. And for that reason, I am all on board the Sony train. I keep this Canon around and occasionally shoot photos with it. But for video, it's Sony, and that's the end of the story for me. Thank you very much for watching. If you're into these tech ones, leave me a comment because I'll make more of them. I've got a ton of fun gear that I don't really take the time to review. So if you're into it, let me know. If you want to like this video, if it was helpful, that means a lot to me. If it wasn't helpful, I'm sorry. There's other things I make that may be more enjoyable. That's it. See ya.